You're listening to
the Antioch Podcast.
Conversations about biblical anti-racism.
Have mercy.
Let me say it one more time. The Antioch Podcast.
A podcast ministry of Madison Church.
Oh, I got Jesus, yeah.
Angela Davis is quoted as saying, "In a racist society, it's not enough to be non-racist. We have to be anti-racist." Hello, and welcome to a special edition of the Antioch Podcast. Today, we are recognizing the Stand Against Racism campaign facilitated by the YWCA. Our theme today is a recommitment to stand against racism. Now, you might be wondering, what is this term anti-racism? Well, anti-racism is the active process of identifying and eliminating racism by changing systems, organizations, structures, policies, and practices, as well as attitudes, so that power is redistributed and shared equitably. Today, we have several of our regular contributors here, as well as a special guest. And I'm going to ask each one of them to introduce themselves by sharing a story about the time they first realized that they were being called to participate in anti-racism.
So I'll start. My name is Susie Dixon. All my life, I've known that there was a difference between the white world and everyone else. I experienced racism being Puerto Rican, marrying a Black man, having mixed children, and moving to Grand Rapids. I was really good at knowing when racism was happening, resisting it, working around it, adjusting to it for survival needs. But the calling came loud and clear the day after the November 2016 election. I saw my whole world and everyone I loved divide. So I knew I had to equip myself by first learning why there was such division in our country, and not just the superficial reasons that we could see, but the below the surface stuff. Number two, I had to learn how to enter into and stay within the conversation, all of these conversations, with grace, with love. And the third thing that I felt really strongly about was learning how to go deeper and work through my own internalizations. So those are my top three.
Thank you, Susie. What you said is just so much of that resonates with me, and having a particular moment when okay, this is work that I am called to do. And I think for me, one of those, I think it was kind of a two-part. I think before it was a term anti-racism, being an African-American woman, and having, whether it's an Institute for Healing Racism or some other kind of gathering together to share stories. And then when the Christian Reformed Church decided that it was going to venture into these conversations of anti-racism and created these task force and community conversations about anti-racism, I found myself being called upon a lot. Could you come and represent, as a person of color? And at first I kind of resented it because it is tiring and it is fatiguing to be the Black voice that's in there. The white people always changed and the people of color always stayed the same in this thing, right? But I really felt called to do it. As fatiguing as it was, as tiring as it was, it kept resonating within me. If I don't do this, who is going to do this? Because this is part of my work, but it's also a part of my life as well. African American, my husband, children all identify as African American, and for a while I was doing this kind of work because I wanted the world to be different for my children. Well, my children are all grown, so now I want the world to be different for my grandchild. She's only 3, and I want her to live in a world that's much better than this, much better than the experiences I had and that my kids had. So yeah, there's oftentimes this kind of moment when you, at least for me, it was, well, if it's not me, then who is it going to be? And who am I waiting for?
My name is Libby Heisinger. My story of realizing I needed to commit to the work of anti-racism actually starts with vegetarianism. I became a vegetarian when I moved out of my parents' house and went to college, and I had been one for a few years. And I was talking to a friend who just didn't really understand where I was coming from, and I was encouraging him to read a book that shared a lot of information. And he said, I don't want to read that book because if I read it, I will have to change. And that made me so mad. My thought was like, but that means you already know everything. Like, if you know that what's inside of this book is going to require that you change, then you already know enough and you have to change. And then a few weeks after that, I got invited by my church to attend an anti-racism training, and they would pay my way to go. And I had this thought, if I go to that, then I have to change. And my eyes opened to the hypocrisy, but also the call to action of, that means I already know enough that I have to change. And that means I have to do this work. And that started my journey. I think I hadn't quite committed to the work yet, but I knew that I had to learn, and I had to learn more. And once I got there, then I could fully make that commitment.
Wow, Libby, that was so rich. As a vegan, I'm so glad that you're vegetarian. But there is such a strong connection. It's a justice issue, right? It can be framed as a justice issue. I should say that. But thank you so much for sharing that. And I wonder if who's ready next to share your story of when you've had that sense of calling, that you are being called to this work of anti-racism.
I can go next. I'm Pennylyn Dykstra-Pruim. I'm the supposedly special guest. I get to have this conversation with these amazing people who are actually really inspiring in all this work. My story of first being called kind of goes back to when I moved back to Grand Rapids in 1998. And we started attending a church. And I remember that one thing impressed me about the church was that the church was obviously concerned about and trying to handle the issues of race and racism. And I remember early on in our time there, I kind of talked with the pastor and I said something like, I kind of wish we didn't have to deal with these issues. And the pastor said, well, we can't get there if we don't work on it. And then, shortly thereafter, I signed up for a church-sponsored Institutes for the Healing of Racism. So that was kind of the first little, hey, you got to be thinking about this and working on this, or it's never going to be to that place you'd love to live in, right? But then over the years, as I've raised children who are biracial and watched them just navigate different things in life, it's really been this constant reminder that I need to keep working on this. As Michelle said, to make the spaces and the culture that we live in better for my children, maybe one day my grandchildren, but because we all need to be engaged in this work. It's important for how we navigate life together.
Thank you for that, Penny. It's just amazing how, those moments where we think, I don't have to be involved. And it's like, or do I really want to be involved? Especially if you're thinking about the emotional weight of it, right? Someone else can do it. I don't have the expertise. It's not my thing, but then there's this moment of clarity that we also often have sometimes to say, oh, wait a minute. Maybe I am being called to this. And so speaking of calling, Reggie, I wonder if you would be willing to, to speak into this, because I know you know a lot about calling.
Yeah, thanks, Michelle. I know a little bit about calling. I'm Reggie Smith, and I am the director for diversity for the Christian Reformed Church in North America. And I would say that my whole journey began by joining a biracial church in the Lawndale neighborhood of Chicago. And my education began just by being born in Chicago, which at that time was called the most segregated city in America. And that education began by watching my entire neighborhood go up in flames, and seeing the National Guard, seeing Army men walking down my street. And so that was kind of like my introduction into, I didn't know was going to be my calling. And so joining that church was kind of my first toe in the water. And then probably my second time was when I decided to go to seminary and had the opportunity to attend a synodical meeting in which they were talking about the church's ties at that time to the Church of South Africa, the Afrikaner church, and listening to this conversation between blood and race, and I became kind of distraught and angry all at the same time, and asking myself the question, I don't think I want to do this, or I don't think I want to be a part of this denomination, and which led to even before, then right after that, then the Lord told me that I was going to marry a white woman. And I said, no, I'm not. And apparently he won. And so I came kind of as a Jonah to this whole journey of this calling, because it's not a job, it's not my career, it's a vocation. And so that kind of set the stage for me to my present position right now.
I knew you had a story. I just knew you had a story. That is so good. Eric, what's your story? How did you sense this calling to do anti-racism work?
I didn't know you had that same experience with a riot, Pastor Reggie. Because that's kind of where mine started too. I grew up in a very rural white community in West Michigan where I didn't know anybody who was Black or anybody who was a Democrat. The good Christian way was to be white, Christian, and Republican. And those three things kind of were all hand in hand. And when I was a senior in high school, Rodney King was arrested and beaten by the police. And that footage went on television really just before I graduated. And I remember talking about this with a few classmates, like, can you believe that the police beat people like that? I had nothing to contextualize that experience. And then when I was a freshman in college, the verdict came out, and I had another experience where I couldn't believe that someone could be so mad that they would burn down a city. I had nothing to give that kind of thing meaning in my life. And so I thought about it that entire summer. I had just joined a multi-ethnic church, and I was like, for me, just being around any kind of diversity at all was a very, very novel experience. But I realized I don't know anything. And I got to know something like this. Like, people just burned down a city. Like, if I don't understand this, I'm really not educating myself as a college student. So when I got back to college, I knew I needed to learn more, and I figured that I needed to get a mentor. So I walked into a very new office on the campus, and there was someone that had a position there, I think a newly hired staff member who is like the diversity or inclusion staff person to mentor mostly students of color. And I just said, like, can I meet with you? And then after we met the first time, I asked if I could meet regularly. And so for the next 4 years, I think we sat down at least once a week. And in that process, I realized that I was being called to that in student leadership, and then after graduation into leadership in my church and in different places where I've worked since then.
What I so appreciate is that there's so many different paths to doing anti-racism work, right? There's so many different calling stories, whether it was a national event that happened, we catch it on the news and it captures our imagination. And even more than that, it grabs our heart and it grabs our faith. Or it's a personal situation that we are in. We look at our lives, or it's a class, or it's just the reality of the significance of the moments that we're in. I'm so appreciative. And I think that's helpful for our hearers and our listeners to hear. There is no one way to get into this anti-racism work. I think what we also heard is that you may think this is not about you, and then one day you're going to wake up and God is knocking at your heart and saying, yes, this really is about you. So we've established that we've all had this sense of calling, this sense of urgency that's stirring up within us about doing this work. So what does it look like? What does anti-racism work look like in your lives? How, in what ways, either vocationally or in other ways, in what ways do you try to advance anti-racism? I'll start off this time because it's very easy. I am the Executive Associate to the President for Diversity and Inclusion at Calvin University. That's my paid work, but it's more than my paid work. It is my passion. I really want to be about helping to change structures, helping to inform policies, and bringing that diversity lens to the conversations at the highest levels of decision making. That's a very tangible way that I get to do this work. Other way that I live this out is by being my authentic self. So in various spaces. So when I show up as Michelle. I don't hide my race. You can catch me on one day and I'll be super fly. You can catch me on another day and I'll look a little conservative, but I'm always showing up as myself and trying to bring attention to the disparities that exist. So being willing to be a part of the conversations, even when conversations are hard, even when I'm tired, is how I try to advance the cause of anti-racism. Libby, I'm going to ask you to speak into this. How do you do this work? How does it show up?
My vocation is in a bit of a flux right now. I graduated from seminary last year, and while I was in seminary, I realized that I was surrounded by so much potential energy for change. I'm in this room of future leaders, and my calling there was to make sure that my classmates knew they had to learn something, that there was something that they didn't know, and when they went out into their ministry, knowing about how racism was going to impact their congregants was essential for them as future leaders. So that was a lot of one-on-one relationship building while I was in seminary. Now, after seminary, I am beginning work with CORE, Congregations Organizing for Racial Reconciliation, to be an anti-racism educator. But I also work part-time in a library. And one of the things I love about libraries, it's all about information ethics and about making sure that different stories are findable and accessible. And I love how the work of anti-racism is just built right into it. A lot of my work is finding leaders and those folks with potential energy and poking holes, helping people identify maybe gaps in their knowledge and places where they really need to maybe get angry, and kind of helping white people realize that there's a big problem and they need to care.
Libby, you taught me a new word, library ethics. I didn't know that was a word, but I'm gonna keep that word because that's a really good one. And I appreciate you sharing that. This started when you were a student in seminary, right? Just taking a look around and say, hey, my colleagues need to know, my peers need to know this, and then just looking for ways to carry that on. I'm becoming a trainer as well as in a library, right? Mind-blowing. Yes, you can do anti-racism work as working in a library, right? By looking at how is information being distributed? How is it made available? So information ethics is so cool. So thank you for sharing that and stirring our imagination. Really appreciate that.
Another part of this, of the kind of overlap of being a student and a library nerd, is I spent a lot of time focusing on the curriculum of my courses and noticing that I'm learning about Christian history and Christian thought throughout the years, and somehow it's being presented to me only by white authors and by mostly male authors, and how that is entirely out of sync with the history of Christianity and the present of Christianity, the fact that white Christians are not the majority, but in fact the minority right now. And how is it that all of my texts are by white people? That does not match the reality of Christianity. And questioning that's one of my favorite places to poke holes.
Livy, I wish I would have had students like you in my classes.
I don't know that all of my professors loved having me, but we grew together.
Penny, what about you? What does anti-racism look like in your work?
So similar to Michelle, anti-racism work is part of my job description, right? I'm the Associate Dean for Diversity and Inclusion. So as part of my job, I do a lot of this kind of training and work and awareness building and courses in the context of a university. But I think one thing that I think is important for our listeners to kind of wrap their heads around is that sometimes when it comes to racism and anti-racism work, we do need to be confronted fairly forthrightly and directly. But for a lot of us, and this is one of the areas where I do a lot of work currently, is for a lot of people to enter into the conversation, they need kind of a winsome, not too difficult on-ramp. So one of the things that I have been trying to do a lot in the last few years is provide a lot of people who are well-meaning, but maybe they just don't feel like racism is my issue, but to provide good on-ramps for those people and for conversations that really can bring us all to a really good place. So a couple examples are working with cultural intelligence or interpersonal cultural intelligence, but also working on listening skills and empathy skills and all these things that we need to do this anti-racism work well. And if we go at it about the right way, one of the things I like to do, and I've been doing a lot of work on, is just giving, like I said, a bigger swath of people, well-meaning people, winsome, productive, constructive feeling, and not particularly threatening on-ramps to that conversation. I'm not saying that we don't sometimes need those really direct confrontations with the racism in our society, but just you ask, like, how am I doing this work right now? And that's one of the ways I'm doing this work.
And you do it really well, Penny. I've really appreciated the sensibilities that you bring to some of the conversations that we have on campus. Penny and I work at the same institution, and we have been privileged to be able to partner with her on some events from time to time. And in fact, the original version of the Stand Against Racism event was going to be a story table that she and I were going to partner together on. And so this is how she is being welcomed into the Antioch Podcast family. Just because of the ways that she has, the insights that she has about how to create some gentle on-ramps. But at the same time, you don't want to get her mad, because when she is mad, when she is a bit feisty, she will call out some stuff. So she has that, within her toolkit, both those winsome ways of encouraging people to think a little bit different, broaden their horizons, and we all need some of those tools. But we also need we've tried knocking gently, and so now we're going to bring out the truck, and we're going to bring out the sledgehammer, because we need to make sure that you know that what is going on right here is just not right, and then there is another way. Yeah, so thank you for that, Penny, for reminding us of that. Either Reggie or Eric or Susie, how would you want to respond, if you want to respond at this time?
Yeah, so I love that you just admitted about her feistiness, because I really hope some of my colleagues are listening so that they can say, oh yeah, there's someone else that's feisty out there. So thank you.
For me, advancing anti-racism is a little tricky. I kind of feel like white men talk too much, and when we talk, the dynamics in groups change. And so this is a complicated question for me, because sometimes I feel like I'm given too much credit. So I had to think about this one when you sent out the questions. I've got 3 things that I try to do. The first one is reading. The second one is relationship. And the third one is reaction. So if I was going to do my 3-point sermon, I got my 3 R's, but like reading stands in for like, I need to get information. There's information that I don't have that I'm not going to get naturally just from living. And I can't really ever do enough to gather information. And so that means I have to go looking for it, and that it won't be on the surface. So I have to subscribe to things that will show up on my Facebook wall. I have to find news from the perspective of people of color. I can't listen to enough voices of people of color to fill in the gaps in my knowledge. There's just too many holes. The second one is relationship. For me, it was finding mentors. So when I was a student, it was a college mentor. When I was at church as a musician, I found a mentor who could teach me how to play the piano in a style that I was trying to learn, and just listen. And mostly as a white guy, I'm going to learn more from just listening and not yeah-butting. And that's been something that I've really wrestled with, because there's some stuff that I just don't get, and I'm impressed that people hang in there with me. But reacting is really important too. And reacting means doing something different. And I think as white folks, we're kind of taught that like where this really needs to go is to not say the N-word and not say mean things, to be a kinder person. And kindness just doesn't cut it if my reactions are just limited to how kind I am to people. I'm really not going to change the system that keeps things so difficult for so many people that I love. And my culture, my whiteness, is going to drive me towards inaction, either because I think it's impolite or because I feel helpless, because it's such a big problem. And when I learn about it, I feel overwhelmed. And so for me, it comes down to some really easy things to list, but maybe hard to do. It's about loving my neighbor as myself through voting, through advocacy, through giving, through service, and kindness as well. And, really it's like if I get to know people who are different from me, I'm not just going to be motivated by the idea of doing something in an anti-racist way. I'm going to do it because I love somebody I really know. And that makes it frustrating for me when I'm dealing with other white folks, because I know they don't know very many people. And so the issues are so much more abstract, and that makes me angry, frankly. And then I wrestle with my own anger about, I don't know if I know how to be as nice as Penny sometimes, with like being an easy on-ramp, because I get frustrated too easily by people who are where I was just recently, and I have to remember that I was there too.
I appreciate you sharing that, Eric. I think that's, I appreciate the self-awareness that you have, and just saying, okay, I am entering into a conversation, but I'm entering into the conversation in a particular body, and in a particular body that has been labeled, that has some privilege, whether you feel you enjoy the privilege or not, but others are assigning privilege, others are making assumptions. So just being self-aware and trying to be equitable, trying to be a listener, trying to be in the learning position is takes time to develop, and a great deal of vulnerability to be able to do that, to be willing to be viewed with suspicion, to be willing to be to get angry and to want to say something about it, because whenever we, I mean, the reality is whether we are offering a gentle nudge and a soft on-ramp, or we're offering a hard shake and a, let's tear down the system, no matter which path, there's someplace in between, we're going to get criticized, right? If we're offering a gentle on-ramp, oh, you're not taking this seriously, you don't know who you are, you don't really get it. If we offer the hard nudge, let's shake up the system, we need to recreate everything, oh, you're just too radical, it's just too much, it doesn't take all that. So no matter where we are, we're setting ourselves up for criticism. So having that conviction, knowing our why we're doing this work is so important, and hearing the call to do this anti-racism work, and then recommitting to this anti-racism work on a regular basis. Because if any of you are like me, there have been more than a couple of times when I was ready to say, "Oh, forget it. It's not worth it. I don't need to do that." Reggie, go ahead. Take it away.
Yeah, there's lots of times when you want to just say, "Can I do something else?" And I guess for me, it started a long time ago when I became a student at Calvin Seminary, and I knew going in that I had to know more of their history than they had to know of mine, because I had to equip myself to enter into these spaces, these white spaces, in which I had to approach it from a subversive kind of perspective, that I could be, because before the position I have now, I was for almost 3 years the director for race relations and social justice for the CRC. And so I'm invited into these spaces in which Eric kind of alluded to. People don't even realize that they're in a bubble. They don't even realize their own biases. They don't even realize their own blind spots. And so I come in and most are thinking, well, he doesn't know a whole lot about the CRC. And then I start talking about their history, like, what? How did you know that? And it becomes a way of entering to this story, entering to this history of saying that I know your history, but I bet you don't know mine. And it becomes an opportunity to kind of burst through. It's almost as if I'm operating like a Nathan, talking to a David, telling him a great story about a little lamb that was taken by this king, and he got upset about what this guy comes in and takes the lamb and use it for his dinner. And then Nathan says, well, you do know that's you, right? you do know that's you. Oh, snap. How in the world did he do that to me? I should have saw it coming. But for me in this work, a lot of folks, they never see it coming. They never anticipate that someone else would begin to deconstruct their own history in order for them to open up either a crack or even to see a light of how much that history is small. It's not big. It's not spacious enough to handle all other kinds of people who are also a part of that space as well, even though that they may not be in that predominantly white space, but these other histories, these other experiences are also in there. And I want to help to kind of open up of being this guy who comes in subversively, who they never would think, well, he doesn't know who we are. And really to kind of use that as kind of I love what Pennylyn said, as an on-ramp, to help people to enter into a bigger space of history and experiences that they've never ever entertained.
So I love what you're saying. And I think for me too, it's like we want to get more people to realize that racism, race issues, it's not just an issue or a problem for some of us that's like our little thing, but racism is actually a defining facet of life for all of us. And so to bring people into that conversation, however they get there, and then to engage them and keep them coming back to the conversation is so important.
Yeah, so a really tangible way that I try to advance anti-racism work. Everyone that knows me knows that I'm always challenging the status quo. Some call it disturbing the peace. And I am disturbing peace, but I feel like I'm disturbing fake peace. So once I see something that's just not quite right, it's a little off, I have to talk about it. It has to come out. So I expose it, and then I invite other people into, do you see what I'm seeing? And I'm really inclusive. So I try to include people with various viewpoints into the conversations with the hope of learning from each other and growing more awareness and understanding. So a really simple example was last night. This Disney family sing-along was on, and I don't even know how it ended up on that station. But anyway, I was watching it because there are some cool songs there. So anyway, the Pocahontas song came on, and so the TV had the split screen where on one side on the screen was a white girl singing the Pocahontas song. Meanwhile, on the other side of the screen is Pocahontas, running around and being Pocahontas. Okay, so Pocahontas is not white. All right, so that's the first thing. And so I called my husband over and I asked him, "What do you see here?" And he was like, "You're watching Disney." And so then it opened up, conversation and space to go deeper into what are the systemic subtleties that we all experience and normalize. So
yeah, I so appreciate, Susie, how you just brought out kind of like the normalization
Yep.
of stuff, right?
Yeah.
And this stuff, it can be something as simple as, who's singing the Pocahontas song on the Disney sing-along channel, right? This thing that's supposed to bring the community together and give us something to do, but yet, is it portraying something? And I don't know if Pocahontas would really want a white woman singing her song, but that's a whole nother conversation. That's the other part of the broadcast that we do. But I really appreciate, because sometimes it's these little things that just say, oh, come on, what else, right? I mean, you're fighting on one side of these big systemic issues, right? And you're trying to make progress, and it gets so frustrating. And then, you're in your immediate circles, many of us, I suspect, are the people that when we walk into the room, everybody's eyes rolled back into the back of their head, like, oh, here we go. What are they going to say now? What are they going to say now? And then there's just these little pebbles that are in your shoes, right? These little things. It's like, what is it? And that's sometimes the weight of all of this. I sometimes used to say, and probably would still say now, it's like, what, if I had my way, what I would rather be doing is staying at home, watching Betty Davis movies and eating popcorn. That's what I would rather do, and not have to deal with any of that kind of stuff. Sci-fi movie is even better, particularly from the 50s and the 60s. That's what I want to watch. I don't want to have to deal with all of it, because this is just so hard. It is emotionally taxing. So many times you feel like you've made progress or steps ahead, and sometimes no one sees it. And so then people question, do you really do anything? And you want to say, look, you don't understand all that it took to do this, and you don't even see it or appreciate it. And then sometimes you just get smacked back down. It's like, yep, I tried it. You get smacked back down, and you're trying to recover from those wounds and say, okay, is it worth it? And so for me, then I think, let me think of my granddaughter. Yeah, it's worth it. But I tell you, on some days, retirement looks pretty good. Anyone else had any kind of experience, or has this raised up anything within you saying, yeah, this is, I've not wanted to, there's been times when I just wanted to say, stop. Just stop. I need to take a break. I need to breathe.
I have that as a fairly regular thing. I debated whether I should talk about this or not, but I think I will. And I'm really good at feeling sorry for myself. That's something that, in general, when I'm the least healthy version of myself that's out there, I am in self-pity quite deeply. And doing anti-racism work, especially as a white person, involves getting your feelings hurt. Just as that's just a standard factor. And as a guy, like I will cry fairly easily, I think. And sometimes I go and want to lick my wounds. One time recently, and I should have called people that I do podcasting with, and I don't know why I didn't think about this, but it might have been late at night. I think that was actually the case. And I went, and there was a discussion forum that I had participated in maybe a couple of years ago, but I hadn't been an active member. But it was an anti-racism discussion group, and I asked this question. My feelings had gotten hurt, and the response that I got back in the discussion group was quite harsh. Some of it was accurate, but harsh. And it made me want to throw in the towel, because you can't read tone when it's a text or on Facebook. You just can't. But my takeaway was that, like, people here, I didn't get the sense that I was loved. And I think they were trying to be loving by telling me the truth, but because I couldn't catch tone, I missed a part that would usually help hold me in the conversation. I'm still working through this one, because I know tone policing is a real thing, and I was doing that. But at the same time, it made me realize that, like, for me to do this work, I have to have relationships with people that I know that they care about me, so that when they have to tell me something hard, I know that the relationship isn't going to end because I did something wrong or I made a mistake. And I'm not good at that yet. And I've been doing this for a long time, and it's still really, really hard. And so, I have those throw in the towel moments as a pretty regular thing, but I feel fortunate that I have relationships with people who will lovingly tell me the truth that I need to hear, and I get to hear the tone and the content.
I have moments where, also as a white person in this work, I wonder how much can I actually, or should I do? And those questions about, like, what's my place, sometimes makes me think I should just throw in the towel altogether. But then I also hear, like, but no, white people need to see other white people to help model that they should care. And yet also white people should be helping us turn our eyes to the people that we're not naturally listening to. So there's this paradox of being a white person in anti-racism work, where you're at one point trying to model, and at the other point trying to get people to stop paying attention to you. And how do you do that? And some days it's hard to strike that balance. But the more I think about it, the more my mind comes back to this painting that's played a pretty big role in Christianity. It has Christ on the cross, but John the Baptist pointing at him, and his finger is really long. And if you look at the painting, you're like, his hand looks really weird. But the point of John the Baptist in this painting is he's got this long finger that's pointing at Christ. And how can I draw attention to myself as this model that diverts attention away from me into doing, one, this work that Christ has called us to, but also in such a way that eventually people will stop listening to me. And it's just going to be a long journey of getting better at that.
I really appreciate you, Libby and Eric. I'm just sharing the tensions, right? And the emotional roller coaster, as well as the passion for doing this work, and even the questioning, right? I think too often when people think of anti-racism work, that they're thinking, as Penny alluded to, like, this is a people of color thing, right? You all are impacted by racism, and so you should be doing this kind of work and leading in this effort. Well, the reality is that racism impacts everyone. It impacts us individually, it impacts us culturally, it impacts us systemically, institutionally, it impacts all of us. And so we really need all hands on deck to do this work. And unfortunately, whether we're in the people of color group or identify as white, there have been people within our groups that have spoken words, done things that have wounded other people, either other people within their group or other people across the racial barriers, and it makes it hard. And I don't think we've allowed enough space to talk about the wounds that we have received in doing this work, and just how hard it is, right? And I think there are places I should rephrase that. I think there is room enough for people of color to get together to talk about how have I been wounded and impacted and doing this kind of stuff, and for white people to get together and say, how have we been wounded and impacted by this, and then for us together. But this is a little bit different than the caucusing that happens in the core groups, but just kind of like those safe spaces for people who are trying to do this work and have just run into a buzzsaw and are wounded. And how can we, a healing place, right? Just a healing place, not trying to one up anybody or not trying to bring in the research and not trying to guilt anyone, but just a place to say, it hurts. And I'm thinking about giving up, so that we can rally around each other and say, don't give up. We need you. We need you around the table. And yes, it hurts, and we'll be like Aaron and her, and we'll stand on either side of you and lift you up. Keep your hands up so that you can keep doing this. But thank you too for so much for sharing that particular insight. And Penny, you were going to add to this.
Yeah, I was just going to say that complacency is not an option. And when I say that, I also want to admit that for a lot of different pieces of my life, I've been complacent. And I think that actually for a lot of well-meaning people, especially people who can identify with kind of majority culture, this complacency is actually part of our problem, right? And it's not that we're not well-meaning or that we don't have good hearts or that we don't try to be kind, but we're just a little complacent. And what has really been inspiring for me and helpful for me is actually this metaphor that I believe Beverly Daniel Tatum has used, where she talks about our life as sort of being on one of those people movers at an airport. And if you're just not doing anything or standing still, you're going to be moving in a certain direction. And in order to not move in that direction that everyone else is moving in, you have to actually turn around and actively walk the other direction. And then she uses this as a metaphor for actually anti-racism work. If we're complacent and don't do anything, we're just riding along. And then actually we are part of the problem, and we are buying into and just active in the racism that's in our society. So if I don't want to be active, I have to actually battle my own complacency, turn around, walk the other way, do things actively to be an anti-racist, or I'm actually just buying into the system and being part of it.
Reggie, were you going to jump in, or were you just saying amen?
I'm a kid who grew up in the 70s, and so one of the big things in the 70s was heavyweight fighting, and so I grew up with Muhammad Ali and Joe Frazier and George Foreman, and I always appreciated Ali because of his style. And one of the things that I watched about him is that when he would be in a prize fight with someone like Joe Frazier, that he had this tactic called rope-a-dope.
Yes.
And rope-a-doping was that he would put his hands up, and Joe Frazier would just be pounding him, and think that he was getting, the better of him. But what was actually happening is that he was resting. He was resting while he's getting pounded, and all of a sudden Joe Frazier's getting tired, and then Muhammad Ali would just get this burst of energy and start wailing on him. And I think that I think that very often we need to do racial rope-a-doping, in which we have to sometimes put our hands and we get beaten, but sometimes that's called resting. And we're resting while we're taking these blows, whether they're microaggressions or other things that are coming at us. But it's a tactic. It's a coping mechanism in order to build resilience. And part of this journey, part of doing this work, it's a very helpful metaphor for me as I'm doing this work and in the spaces that I am, that I have to very often do racial rope-a-doping in order to find some time, to find some new energy, to stay in this fight in order to do it for the long haul.
You've given me a new term and a new image. I'm gonna have to take my picture of Muhammad Ali back out and set it up as an inspiration. He's gonna be the only male imaged in all my female heroes. But Reggie, you started us on a conversation, and I know we're getting ready to come to a close. But you provided some insight, some wisdom on how to survive in doing this work, right? The racial anti-racism rope-a-dope, right, is one of those things that we're could do. I wonder if others could share either a word of wisdom or a resource that has been helpful for you on this journey. So if there was someone who's on this path, and no matter where they are along the path, what kind of sage advice or resource would you want to offer someone who is on this journey?
Yeah, so for me, one of the things that keeps me in the conversation, and let me go back to Muhammad Ali, because that was a really good image, and he was a trash talker too, right? So and that was my upbringing. I was really good at insulting and that verbal stuff. So being in this work, it's really easy to resort to insulting someone, right? So that for me, that was part of the internal work that I had to do within myself, and say, okay, if I'm going to be in this space, I need to not verbally attack this person. I need to come in with the hope that the light will go off for them. And like how you were saying, Libby, that you want to point them to Jesus. And so what keeps me in this conversation is knowing and having seen those light bulbs go off within people, and they're able to see something that they weren't able to see before. And this is exciting. It's encouraging. And that's what keeps me going, because there are so many times when that light bulb doesn't go off and those spaces are dark. And so I have this hope. And that's what keeps me going, a hope that people will become more aware of how we have been deformed to function within our internalized systemic ways of thinking that elevate some and oppress others. And so I'm thankful for a wonderful group of people with various different backgrounds and ideologies. And right now, Monday mornings, we get together and we pray, we vent. We do a lot of venting, but we also encourage each other, and we give each other space to process. We're constantly processing, and okay, how can we do this well? How can we encourage each other, strengthen each other, because we're going back in the ring, right? And so we need to love each other, strengthen each other. So that would be the biggest thing that I would encourage people, is to bring some people together that are doing this work, and set some time apart where you are talking through those hard things. For instance, okay, if as a person of color, this is how I felt like I needed to be inferior in this space, like I needed to shrink back. And also then for a white person to be able to say, oh my goodness, I didn't realize that the way I was doing that, I was acting like I was superior. So having this space where we can talk about it, process together, we even have tears together. That's what I would encourage people to do, is create a group of people that are intentionally working through this stuff together.
One of the things for me that I would say maybe isn't sage advice, but I hear lots of white folks say things like, I don't see color, I just see people. And I would say, okay, if that's true, I want you to try something. I want you to try going on a fast, a whiteness fast, and see if you find those same viewpoints reflected back to you from people of color. And if you're a person of color, you could do the same activity by trying to go on a whiteness and your own racial groups fast, and find out, what do people who are people of color who don't look like me, what are they thinking? So like finding those news sources. There are news sources out there that they do the news through a racial lens, identifying news stories or talking about their impact on different racialized groups of people. That would be a fascinating thing to do for at minimum 3 months, but maybe up to a year, and see if your biases hold. And don't find like the one conservative, person of color who does all the commentary maybe on one network. Representative voices, find 10 to 20 voices. I would go as far as saying, like, if it's your spiritual life that you hold as something that's really important, do the media fast with authors and theologians who are people of color who don't come from your group. Same thing with music. If you went on a whiteness fast from music and found Christians who are writing music who represent their people group, do you get the same messages? And if there's differences, ask questions like, why is that? I think for white folks, too many of our messages are that we deserve to be comfortable and God is invested in our comfort. And that may be an idol.
So I just wanted to suggest for some of us who like to read, a couple books that could be a nice next step. The first one's a little bit older, but it's really good, called Whistling Vivaldi by Claude M. Steele. And the slightly more recent one, similar topic, is called Bias by Jennifer L. Eberhard. And both of these books really talk about bias and prejudice. And they kind of make the point, it is pervasive and it kind of makes sense, but it is not okay. And I think those are great places for some of us to start. And then if I had to give any advice, I would just say, open your eyes, open your heart, and then open some spaces with your family and friends to have some really good conversations.
Thank you for that. Those are some really good resources. For me, I'm thinking a little less about resource, and I think that what I'm thinking about most, if I was giving advice to someone who was on this journey, no matter what their identity is, take time to take care of yourself, because you are, sooner or later, you're going to run into a buzzsaw. Sooner or later, you're going to know that you are right about something and you get slapped down. Sooner or later, you're going to do something and it is marvelous and everybody thinks you can walk on water. You'll get some things right. You'll get some things wrong. Be a little gentle on yourself when you need to. When everybody else is beating up on you, make space to take care of yourself and be gentle with yourself. And if you're doing this work and it is hard and you need to step out of the journey for a minute, it's okay. Sometimes we need to get rested. Sometimes we need to, have that raven bring us some food and point us to some water. We need the widow to come by and make us something. And it's okay. We just need to have a plan to get back up and to get back out there. But it is okay if you need to say the wounds are too deep and I need to step out for a minute, because none of us individually are going to solve racism. None of us individually is going to stop this, but all of us collectively can make a dramatic change in how we do this work.
So sometimes I hear white people often talking about well, I don't feel safe having these discussions. And I think sometimes there's a difference between discomfort and being unsafe. And for white folks, we got to, yes, absolutely take care of yourself emotionally, but sometimes we're a little too good at that, where we mistake the disquiet that facing sin has in our lives, and we mistake that with being unsafe. And so if you're feeling uncomfortable, I would just challenge you to ask yourself, am I being convicted? Or am I unsafe? Because for some people, these discussions could end in being physically unsafe. And for most of us as white people, the worst case scenario is that we feel emotional. And that's really a different endpoint.
That's a really good point. I'm glad you brought that up. Okay, we're about ready to wrap this up. So any more pieces of wisdom, sage advice, a resource? Libby, it's on you.
I have a quick one. A foundational thing in my journey has been actually a chapter of Justo Gonzalez's book Mañana called Reading the Bible in Spanish, in which he talks about viewing your history through a non-innocent lens, not telling your history in a shiny, happy way, and not reading the Bible in a shiny, happy way, but honest telling. And that has led me on a journey of realizing that I am a part of history. I am a product of history. I didn't just spring out of the ground one day, and that the wounds of history are still alive and influencing us today. And so taking time to get to take an honest look at history and questioning some of what you were taught in your high school textbooks.
Very good. Anyone else? This has been a really rich conversation. And I want to make sure that we do give a shout out to the Antioch Podcast to say thank you so very much. And so if you're looking for a resource to how to continue the conversation, how to become more informed, become a subscriber to the Antioch Podcast. We record frequently, regularly. Our conversations are just like this. And we just invite you to join in the conversation. That's a way to keep yourselves engaged. That's a way to learn a little bit more. And that's a way to get a little uncomfortable sometimes too. But I just want to thank you all so much for being a part of this. Thank you all so much for tuning in and listening to this special edition to the Antioch Podcast. And thank you for joining us in celebrating and recognizing the YWCA's campaign to stand against racism. Please stand against racism with us. Thank you.